So what does mean stand for? What are the different components we'll learn about in this course? Mean comprises a set of 4 technologies, and this is what it stands for. The M stands for MongoDB, and it's the database we'll use in this course. So the part where we will be able to persist the data the users of our application generate, like the user data itself, but also like posts or messages they send, things like that. The E stands for Express, and ExpressJS is hard to understand without the N, so let's quickly fast forward. We also got the A, and the A stands for Angular. Now I'll come back to that N, which is related to the E, but Angular is our client-side technology. It is a JavaScript framework in the end, which we will use to render a nice dynamic UI, user interface, to our users. It runs entirely in the browser, not on the server at all, and therefore it really has just one job: presenting a nice and pleasant, interactive and reactive user interface. Now what's the N then? Well, you probably already saw that something is missing. We got a database and we got something running in the browser. But we certainly also need to run some logic on the server. For example, authenticating users. This is not something we can do in the browser because A, browser code can easily be hacked or changed, and B, it's way too complex. It would take up quite a significant amount of resources and slow down our frontend, our user interface. N stands for node.js, and it's the JavaScript runtime, the server-side language we'll use in this course for our server-side code, so for our core business logic that runs on the server. And now the E also is related to it because whilst Node.js is the language we'll use on the server, Express is a framework for Node.js that makes working with it easier. You wouldn't need ExpressJS per se, but it makes working with it much easier. Just as Angular is a framework for JavaScript in the browser. You don't need it, but it makes things easier. But let's take a more detailed look at all these things. Now I want to look at Angular first. As I already said, Angular runs on the client side in the browser. It's a framework building up on JavaScript or using JavaScript, and it's used to create so-called single-page applications. This essentially means that it handles the entire front-end logic. So everything your user is going to see, Angular is responsible for it, but I'll come back to it in a few seconds. Angular's job is to render the user interface with dynamic data. And that dynamic data part is important, of course. Its job is not just to render some static HTML and some CSS. We wouldn't need JavaScript for that. Its job is to update the UI whenever we have new information. Let's say when you created a new post, we want to immediately update the UI to show that new post there. It also is responsible for handling user input, so validating that user input and also sending it to the server. Because that's the third part it does, it communicates with our backend, so with that Node, Express, Mongo combination that seems to be responsible for that. Angular provides a mobile app-like user experience because since we handle everything in the browser through JavaScript, we never need to reload the page. We just change parts of the page with JavaScript through Angular, and therefore everything happens instantly in a very reactive way, and that is the feeling we know from mobile apps. Now that is still only the front end though. As I said, Node.js is the language we're going to use for the backend, so on the server side, which we also build in this course. Node.js is a server-side library, JavaScript runtime, and you know that JavaScript can run in the browser. Well, Node.js simply takes it, adds some things that are useful on the server, like working with files, working with HTTP requests, and now we can use JavaScript on the server too. Pretty amazing. Node.js listens to incoming requests and is able to send back responses. For example, our Angular app could send a request to fetch a list of all the posts, and Node could handle that request, do something, reach out to the database, and send back a response with all these posts. Node.js executes server-side logic in general, so authentication, anything we don't want to run in the browser for security or performance reasons. And Node.js is able to interact with databases and files. Angular can't do this. It doesn't have access to any file system, and especially not to a file system on some remote machine on a server. And whilst theoretically You could connect to a database from Angular. Since all your client-side JavaScript code is visible to users, you can have a look at it in your developer tools of your browser. It would be very insecure to connect to your database there because you would expose all your credentials and everything. You don't want to do that. Therefore, Node.js is an alternative to PHP, if you know that, or Ruby on Rails, ASP.NET, things like that. And it's rarely used standalone, just like these languages. You typically use a framework along with it. And that framework you typically use is Express. Express is a Node.js framework, so it still uses Node.js, the same language, but it adds a lot of utility features. So it offers additional functionalities, or in general, it makes things easier. ExpressJS is middleware-based, and we'll see what this means once we dive into the code. It basically funnels incoming requests through a chain of middlewares, of steps, where we can do something with the request, read some data from it, manipulate it, check if the user is authenticated, or basically send back a response immediately. This chain allows us to write very structured code, and you will learn everything about it in this course, of course. And last but not least, it includes routing, which means we could render views, so HTML pages with it. We're not going to do this in this course though, because Angular should handle our entire frontend. And again, this is also something we'll see. But more importantly, we can handle different requests to different endpoints, which will be important for connecting Angular to the backend. Because if we want to fetch a list of posts, we want to send some requests to /posts, so our domain /posts. If we want to create a new post, we want to send a different request to our domain /post, for example. And ExpressJS allows us to implement this routing logic so that different requests to different URLs are handled correctly. Again, this will all be implemented step by step throughout the course. So to sum it up, ExpressJS simplifies the usage of Node.js and is a tool we definitely want to use. If you have a PHP background, for example, you could compare it to Laravel for PHP. It makes things easier. There's one thing missing, and that is MongoDB, of course. MongoDB, as I already said, is a database. It's a NoSQL database, to be precise, and it stores so-called documents in so-called collections. Now, chances are you might have heard about SQL databases like MySQL, Microsoft SQL, where you have records, rows, which you store in tables. Now, NoSQL has a different logic than SQL databases. But in general, it's still a database. So you store your application data on a server so that it persists across page reloads, across the user leaving your page, things like that. So any data that is not just temporary data definitely has to be stored in such a database. Now, that NoSQL thing means that this kind of database enforces no schema, so you can have different documents with different pieces of information in the same table or collection, as it is called here, and it also doesn't really work with relations. You will see in this course that we can kind of relate different documents with each other, but in general, it's way less strict and flexible regarding relations than a SQL database is. A NoSQL database is more about storing multiple unstructured documents, though you can get some structure into it, and we will actually do that in this course. I'll come back to what exactly MongoDB is and how it works in the respective sections, no worries. Now, last but not least, it's easily connected to Node. That's pretty cool. It's very easy to integrate, or Node Express to be precise. And we don't connect it to Angular. I already said this. Theoretically, you could find a way, but you don't want to do that because you don't want to expose your database credentials in your browser side code, which can easily be viewed by the user. It's accessible in the developer tools of the browser. So, MongoDB is a powerful database which can easily be integrated into a Node Express environment, and it's very popular these days because it's very flexible and it's highly scalable. It's able to handle a large amount of throughput, so requests per second or write actions per second and read actions per second. And we'll dive deeper into this in the sections where we start working with it. Now, you could theoretically replace it with a different database. You could use a SQL database in a Node Express Angular application too. You're not limited to MongoDB, and I just want to really emphasize this. I'm using MongoDB because it's part of this popular mean stack and it has some advantages, but depending on the application and the type of data you're storing, if it's a data with a lot of relations, maybe a SQL database might be better. And whilst we will use MongoDB in this course, I just want to highlight, this is not a must. You could use any database here. The core logic we'll dive in really is the connection of Angular and Node. So with that, let me quickly come back to what exactly that single page application thing meant and how the big picture of such a mean app looks like before we start diving into our setup of the course and start building our mean app. Now, as I said, in this course, we'll build a single page application with Angular. Now, what is that? What is a single page application? Well, in an Angular app, we'll have one root HTML file, a so-called index HTML file. And we will serve that from our Node server or from a different server. That's important. It can be totally decoupled of our Node backend, and it actually will be. And this HTML page basically includes some script imports that houses our Angular app, so the Angular framework and our own code. And we use that application to dynamically re-render what the user sees without ever requesting a second page to be rendered by the server. Why? Because by having this pattern, we never need to reload the page just because the user maybe clicked on a post and want to see the details. We can instead navigate to that page directly because we don't really leave the page. We just remove some elements from the DOM and add new elements. And all of that is handled for us by the Angular framework. It's really convenient to use and to work with the DOM with it. And therefore, we have a powerful way of immediately changing the page, maybe showing a spinner whilst we're fetching some data behind the scenes. So that list of posts, which we probably still need to get, but we will do that behind the scenes. And this provides a highly interactive mobile app-like feeling, a very responsive and fast web page where we never have to wait, where things always happen. And that, of course, is a great user experience. And this is why we will use JavaScript and Angular, therefore, for the entire frontend, for the entire user interface. And we will use Node, Express, and MongoDB as a backend to which we reach out behind the scenes to fetch data and send data, but the whole user interface is handled as one page only, which is dynamically re-rendered all the time by Angular. With that, let's have a look at the big picture. How does the entire mean stack look like in this course, or in general, not just in this course? We have the client side and the server side. That's important. Client side is what the user sees, the web page as it runs in the browser. Server side is somewhere on a server we deploy where we run our business logic and which the user only indirectly accesses. We'll see how that access works in a second. So on the client, we use Angular, which is a JavaScript framework, so we also use JavaScript implicitly, and we use it to build that user interface. On the server side, we use Node, Express, and MongoDB. Node Express for the logic and MongoDB as a database. As I said, you don't want to connect directly to it from Angular. Now, the client-side Angular is responsible for the user interface, so for the presentation. It's a single-page application, as I explained in the last lectures, and that single-page application can be rendered by our Node backend. So we could have one route which essentially returns that single HTML page, but it can also be totally decoupled from that and be served from a totally different host, some static host like AWS S3, for example. Now on the Node application, we have our core business logic, especially the logic that should not be exposed to the client due to security reasons or performance reasons. We have our persistent data storage, so that database. And we also put our authentication logic there, for example. It's, of course, part of our business logic. I just want to really emphasize that here. The logic where we decide whether an email and a password is valid happens on the server because it can easily be fiddled with on the client, not so much on the server. How do we connect the two pieces then? Well, we exchange requests and responses, and these requests and responses are sent behind the scenes, so-called AJAX requests. You might have heard of this before, and we use exactly the same pattern in Angular. These are requests which can be sent without us needing to reload the page, which is of course exactly what we want. Therefore, the type of data we exchange is not HTML, because we never want HTML code. We do all that presentation and re-rendering logic with Angular. Instead, what we get is so-called JSON data. That's a data format that's really efficient for encoding data like a list of posts. And you will see how it looks like in this course. This is the big picture. This is how the mean stack works, and this is exactly what we will implement in this course. So with that, I'd say enough of the words. Let's get started and let's start setting up the base development environment we'll work with in this course. And let's start building our mean stack application. So for this course, we will need a couple of tools, and we'll install and add them step by step. For example, MongoDB will be added a bit later. What we'll definitely need is Node.js. For one, because we will write and run Node.js code, our server-side logic, but also because even Angular needs it, even if we were not to create our own Node app, not because Angular uses Node.js language features, but because Angular actually is a framework that has a more complex build workflow. So the part where we take our source code as we write it as a developer and transform it into code that runs fine in the browser, that's a bit more complex with Angular, because Angular, for one, uses TypeScript, a superset to JavaScript, so a different language that's heavily based on JavaScript, and, that's important, that does not run in the browser. And to make it run, we need to compile it, and it will be done for us, no worries, but that task runner doing the compilation in the end is Node.js, for example. So this will run all throughout the development process. We won't need to write any code for that, but this is some stuff that happens behind the scenes. And not just the TypeScript to JavaScript compilation. The Angular code itself needs to be bundled and optimized, and we need to reduce the code size by stripping out unused code and minifying it. And all of these are tasks handled by Node.js on our machine whilst we are developing the application, or when we are finishing it up, basically. And Node.js will be used for that too. So we need it for these two reasons: for the Node.js code we write for our backend, and for the Angular build workflow. And to learn more about Angular and the Angular workflow and how it works, definitely check out a course dedicated to Angular, because whilst I will cover some Angular basics in this course, in general, I do expect you to know the very basics about Angular. This is not a course for you if you never touched Angular before. So with that out of the way, download Node.js from nodejs.org, and there pick the latest version, 10.1 in my case. If you're facing issues with that, fall back to the older version, but in general, it's recommended to use 10.1 or whatever the latest version is when you're viewing this. Simply click on that and it will download an installer through which you can walk. It's available for both macOS and Windows and also Linux, and it should automatically give you the right download there. And once you successfully installed it through the installer, we can think about setting up an Angular application, because that is actually what we'll start with in this course. For that, we'll use another tool, and that's the Angular CLI. CLI stands for Command Line Interface, and it's the de facto way of creating Angular apps. Because of that more complex build workflow I mentioned, we need a lot of tools that compile our code, optimize it, and setting all of that up on our own is pretty cumbersome and error-prone. The CLI gives us a project setup where all of that is taken care of and where we can focus on writing our Angular code, our logic. The CLI is installed like this, and it uses npm, the Node Package Manager, to install the CLI tool globally on our machine with this first command here. npm, the Node Package Manager, is installed together with Node.js automatically, so if you installed Node.js, you will have npm. Now let's therefore now install the CLI. I already got Node.js installed, so I can just fast forward to this step. And to install the CLI, you should open your terminal or command prompt on your machine, and then run npm, this Node Package Manager command, which is available with Node.js, install -G for globally, because we want to install that Angular CLI globally on our machine so that we can use it from anywhere on our machine. And then the name of that CLI package is @Angular/CLI. And make sure to not mistype this, the naming is important. You can add a @latest to absolutely fetch the latest version, but it should by default give you that version. Now on Windows, this command should be fine like this. On Mac and Linux, you might need to add a sudo in front of this to get the right permissions to execute this command. Hit enter thereafter and enter your password if you are prompted for it. And thereafter, it will download that CLI package from npm's repository and install it on your machine. This can take a couple of seconds up to minutes, and I'll be back once it's done. So it's done installing, and in my case, I got some errors in between, but that's no problem as long as it finishes with some output where it mentions the package name and version and says updated or added 8, or the number can actually differ, packages. So if you see something like that, it succeeded. You may ignore any errors that happened in between. It was able to recover from these. Now, once this is installed, we can create a new Angular project with the CLI. And we'll add Node and Mongo and Express to that project setup throughout the course. But let's start with the frontend, because that is how we can quickly see something on the screen. So let's create a new project, and for that navigate into the folder where you want to create the project. Once you're in that folder, and you can get there with the cd command on your machine, create a new project with ng-new. That is a command now available due to that CLI package. ng is basically a command made available by that. And then the name of the project. And I will name it mean course, but of course you can pick any name you want. Just make sure it's not starting with a number and it's not named test. That is forbidden. But anything else is fine. Mean course should work. And once you hit enter, it will set up that project. It will create a lot of files in there. Most of them are configuration files for that workflow. We don't need to worry about them. And it will also give us a little dummy app with which we can start. It will also install all the dependencies like the Angular Framework and other dependencies that framework depends on, but also a couple of build or workflow dependencies. So dependencies that compile the TypeScript code, dependencies that optimize the code, things like that. So this can take a while, and I'll be back once it's done. Now, once it is done, you can navigate into that newly created folder with cd and then the name of that folder. And in there, simply run ng-serve to bring up a development-only server. And this is not a server you will use to deploy it. I will show you how to deploy that app towards the end of the course. This is a development-only server that allows you to preview your application. Double-clicking on the index.html file won't work because that will use the file protocol and not the HTTP protocol. And therefore, many features we need are not enabled. And this gives us a real web server running on our machine at this address you see here, HTTP localhost 4200 by default. And you can then go to a browser and simply visit localhost 4200. And on that URL, you should see something like this, some dummy starting page the CLI gives you by default. Now with that set up, we of course want to work on our code. And for that, we need some IDE or some advanced text editor that makes that easier. Now you can use any IDE you want, like Sublime, Atom, WebStorm. In this course, I will use Visual Studio Code. Now let's set it up and open our project in the next lecture. So in the last lecture, we created our Angular application and now we want to edit it. As I mentioned, for this we want to use an IDE or some advanced text editor because that simply makes working with our code much easier. In this course, I will use Visual Studio Code, and that code part is important, not Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code. It's a free IDE, totally free, it's pretty powerful, it's highly extensible, it's awesome. And it's available for Mac, but also for Windows, Linux. You can pick your installer version here if it doesn't auto-select the right one automatically. Simply download it then and walk through the installer it gives you. There should be nothing special about that. And once you got it installed, open it. If you open it, it should look something like this. You probably see that welcome page, and there you can click Open Folder to open that Angular project we created with the CLI a few seconds ago. If you don't see that page, you can always open it through File, Open. Now let's click Open Folder and navigate to that folder. Here I selected that mean course project and I can click open now. And this loads it into this IDE so that we can work on it there. Now, the IDE might look a bit different for you. Maybe it doesn't have this dark theme. It probably has different icons. And that is simply something I fine-tuned for myself. So I like this way of it looking and working. And I will show you how to get there. If you're using a different IDE, you of course have to fine-tune it on your own. For Visual Studio Code, I want to install a certain extension first of all. 2 extensions to be precise. And for that, go to View, Extensions. You might also see a bar on the left where you can click on Extensions icon. And on this page, make sure to install Angular Essentials. Now here I already got that installed. You can search for Angular here and you should quickly find the Angular Essentials package. Search for Angular Essentials otherwise. And that's a pretty amazing collection of different extensions that enhance the IDE to work better with Angular. So simply install this with the install button and feel free to skip or read through the documentation here to find out what's included and how it works. Besides that, I use one other extension which is purely optical. It's the material icon theme here. So by searching for material, you should find it. Also install this if you like the way my icons look in this course. It's purely visual, it gives you nicer file icons, and I quite like these. So with that, you can go back to View Explorer once you're done, and you should see something like this. Well, I also use a dark theme, and you can get that same look by going to that code thing here, Preferences, and their color theme. And here I'm using Dark Plus. By default, you probably are using Light Plus or Light. Now, you can try out these different themes here by simply clicking on them. You can always switch and choose the style you like. Now, with that, you get the same setup as I do. Now, let's get started working on our Angular app. This is the folder the Angular CLI created for us. Time to edit it. So now that we know what the mean stack is, and that we have our basic project set up for this course, let's see what else is inside of this course. So we're pretty much done getting started. In the next course module, we'll dive into building the Angular Frontend. You'll get an Angular refresher there too, though I also recommend diving into some dedicated Angular resources, just as for Node and Express and MongoDB if you want to learn more. But with that, we'll build the core foundation, the things we can see, or we'll at least start building these in that module. Thereafter, we'll already attach our backend, the NodeJS backend, so that we can actually do more than just display a beautiful UI. Well, and we also want to work with data and want to store and fetch that data. And for that, we obviously need a database. So in the module thereafter, we'll add MongoDB to the party and therefore a really great database. I'll show you how to add it and how to work with it from NodeJS and therefore also from Angular. Once we did that, we'll enhance our app. Now that's a very broad term, but we'll add some things to the Angular app, to the Node backend, to turn this into a more realistic and better app. So this will be a really important module. Thereafter, we'll already dive into image upload. That's a super interesting topic, which I was often asked about in my other courses. Here we got it. Here you will learn how to let the user select the image in your Angular app and then upload it to your NodeJS server and store it there. And how to then also, of course, retrieve it. We'll thereafter have a look at another very popular topic, pagination. We get a lot of data in our database, and we typically don't want to fetch all that data in one block. That is typically not what you want to do because it impacts performance, it's more data to download. So here I will show you how you can add pagination, so how you can select chunks, slices of your data to display on a given page. And thereafter we'll dive into authentication. How can we add users, sign up, log in, and how do we store the information whether a certain user is logged in our client-side app and use it to reach protected resources on the server. Thereafter, we'll dive into something which is kind of related to authentication, authorization. Authorization is about ensuring that only users who created a post, let's say, can edit and delete that post. So we'll add this in this module. We're nearing the end of the course thereafter, and we'll dive into error handling. What does this mean, and how could we elegantly handle errors in our Angular app? Once we're done with that, we're pretty much done, and we'll put some optimizations into place, both on the backend and the front end, regarding our code structure, but also regarding performance. And finally, we'll of course deploy our application, actually in two different ways, on one server and on multiple servers. And I will explain the differences in this module, of course. And with that, we're done, and we'll have a complete Mean app finished and deployed. And I'm very confident that once you finish this course, you'll have all the knowledge you need for your next Mean project.